Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Alex Gladstein, who is the Chief Strategy Officer from the Human Rights Foundation, or the hrf.org. And if you haven't heard of them before, they are an organization that is uniting the world to stand against tyranny. And to elaborate on that a little bit, they are a non-profit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally, and they're focused on closed societies. And if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe in your podcast app or on YouTube, because today you're going to learn everything about what we can do to unite against tyranny. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great today.
Pleasure to be here.
So, how would you describe the HRF to someone that haven't heard of you guys before?
Sure. We were created by a variety of political prisoners, actually, from around the world, from different countries. Our founder is Venezuelan, our chairman is Russian. We have people on our board everywhere from China to Chad. And the Human Rights Foundation was created because there really wasn't an organization focusing on what we consider to be the largest problem facing humanity, which is authoritarianism. If you actually consider that more than 4 billion people live under an authoritarian regime today, that's more than half the world's population across more than 90 countries, and that authoritarianism is the driver for so many of the world's problems, it becomes a little confusing why there isn't a more coordinated response. So, for example, the issue of refugees. More than 90% of all the refugees in the world come from dictatorships and tyrannies, authoritarian regimes. There's no refugees fleeing Denmark and Sweden and Norway, for example. If you look at things like access to clean drinking water, if you look at things like absolute poverty, if you look at things like countries that start wars, there are exceptions, of course, but again, 80-90% of the people who live under these conditions are in authoritarian regimes. If you look at things like scientific innovation, patent rates, for example, open societies, liberal democracies absolutely dominate here. And I guess to sum it all up, you could conclude with a photograph from outer space of the Korean Peninsula, and you could see the evidence where at night you have this vibrant, almost exploding with light area in South Korea, where you've seen the creation over the last several decades of incredible technical innovation with everything from cars to televisions to the phones in your pocket to cultural exports like Oscar-winning Best Picture films, K-pop and the Hallyu wave that's taken over the world in many places, food, famous food, all kinds of things, to the political accomplishments, where you have a government in Korea that has now peacefully transitioned back and forth from different parties over the last couple decades. So one of the world's most impressive countries for sure. And then in the north of the DMZ, you have just darkness. It's just dark, it's just black. And the only export is human suffering out of North Korea. And the difference is that one is an open society and one is a closed one. And I think that is certainly a striking example, but there's many more. I mean, look at the difference between Lithuania and Belarus. I mean, look at the difference between Cuba and Costa Rica. So you can go to many parts of the world and you can look at, whether it's the difference between Botswana and Zimbabwe, or whether you want to look at, Tunisia versus Syria. I mean, you can go to literally any part of the world and start to understand that the political structure of a country the governance model dictates the quality of life and the humanity of the people who live in that country. And HRF was founded because there are too many people still living under authoritarianism. And we wanted to create a nonprofit organization that seeks to aid those people who are still stuck under that kind of governance model.
Thank you for that introduction. I really like the visual example of North and South Korea. And with all of the examples that you brought up, I guess most of our listeners understand the problems with authoritarianism and they would like a solution. I kind of guess that many of our listeners also feel powerless because, like you said, 4 billion people are living under these regimes. So how can something so big be changed? Like, from your point of view, where should we start?
Well, we can start with history. At one point, all humans lived under a tyrant of some kind, a king, a feudal system. The idea of democracy, which in many ways is just being ruled by rules instead of rulers, right, was conceived arguably by the ancient Greeks. And it took thousands of years to shape those ideas into what we would maybe call more real democracy in the last few hundred years. A constitutional representative democracy like you might see in the United States or Switzerland or Sweden. And it has taken millennia to shape this idea of being ruled by rules, not rulers, into something that approximates more justice for people. I mean, obviously, democracies at first weren't true democracies. I mean, they still aren't perfect, but they didn't have the same rights for ethnic minorities, for women, and it just took a long, long time to get to where we are today. For maybe perhaps a lot of your listeners live in a democracy and enjoy the fruits of that democracy, but it's not so easy. But the point is that there has been enormous progress, and now almost half the world is under some sort of democracy. So that is something to be inspired by. And if you consider let's say, the cooperative forces that align alongside democracy, you have information, you have technology, and certainly the printing press and later on media technologies like the radio, television, and finally the internet have been incredibly democratizing. And I think that it's really all about this idea of decentralizing power away from one person or a few to many, and having more of a interactive society. So in democracies, bad things still happen. Like democracies can still go to war. Democracies can still pass bad policies. People that you don't like can still be elected. There can be erosion and backsliding. But if you actually have a rule of law set up, if you have a constitution, if you have rights of the people protected, then people can push back and they can sue or write op-eds in the newspaper, or they can protest in the streets and they can change things. This is not possible in dictatorships, right? So I think it's really important that we treasure the progress that we've made with democracies. And if you want to know what you can do to help, a lot of it relates to, spreading information and technology. I think open source software is arguably the front line for freedom around the world. It's not so easy to export democracy, as we've learned. And the idea has been, first of all, hijacked by governments to do bad things, like the invasion of Iraq, for example. But even when look, that violent exportation of democracy, it worked sometimes, Germany, Japan, etc. But it doesn't work all the time, and it's a terrible idea because it ends in a lot of devastation. But what you can export are technical freedoms. So, for example, let's take encrypted messaging. A group of people operating in America in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s came up with a way for two people in the world to communicate privately with each other using just ones and zeros in a way that no government could intercept or spy on. And that was at the beginning based on the work of Diffie and Hellman at Stanford University in the 70s, and then brought to life for users by Phil Zimmerman in the early 90s with this like pretty good privacy, which allowed two people on PCs to trade secret messages. Now, anyone in the world with a phone can download an app called Signal, right, in 2021. And we can trade messages, even do voice calls and video group calls in a way that the NSA or no government can like see what we're doing. They can maybe see that this phone number called this phone number or sent a message, but they don't know what's inside, right? And that's so incredibly powerful. And that is all on the back of like free and open source software. So while we may not be able to like export governance models, those have to be done by the people who live in these countries. As a friend of mine, Vladimir Kara-Murza, always says, he's a Russian democracy advocate. He says basically like, we'll build democracy on our own terms. You guys just stay out of it. You know, we will build it on our own terms. You know, stop supporting our dictators maybe, but like we will build democracy on our own terms. But these tools are what people will use to build these things with, free and open source software. So that has led to my fascination with the impact, primarily of two key FOSS or free and open source software projects, encrypted messaging and Bitcoin, which I feel like is also extremely important in this idea of decentralizing power away from the few to the many. So that's kind of where I'm spending a lot of my time now, is thinking about, you know, how can we share the ideas of free and open source software with people around the world through translation, through workshops, through events, and that's really what occupies my time these days.
That is really interesting. I take with me first a feeling of gratitude for the fact that we are in democracies. Me speaking, I don't know where you're from, but it's easy to take it for granted. I was born into democracy, but they really haven't been here for that long.
No.
And secondary, so I myself is not fully aware of, are there softwares where it's truly untraceable? And do I feel comfortable enough with that? So let's say I was trying to create democracy in a place where there would be severe consequences for me trying to do that. I don't know if I would be confident with the software. So I can see how getting that information out would be very important.
It's a bit of a cat and mouse game where individuals and activists come up with new software and then the government comes up with a way to spy on them, right? We've seen this all throughout the Arab Spring, where tools like Twitter were initially seen as like, oh my God, this is amazing. People can coordinate without a central platform and they can rise up. Well, then we saw the governments take advantage of similar platforms to track everybody. And you're seeing that unfold in China now, most egregiously, right, with all of their social engineering and using all the data that citizens are giving up on their phones every day that basically control society. However, there is a lot to be said for these, you know, private technologies. And I'll just give you a couple examples. I mean, again, this idea that like I'm on my phone today, provably, because it's open source, meaning anyone can audit the code. It's very important to be open source. If it's closed source, like WhatsApp, we don't know what's going on in WhatsApp. So use WhatsApp at your own risk. But Signal is open source. So any hacker in the world, any government official, any citizen can look at the code base and figure out if there's a backdoor. Is there a way to crack this, right? And there isn't. I mean, it's been, let's say, provably created that way. Anyone can look, there's no issues. There's not going to be a backdoor. So, you know, you can use this app to send a communication of any type to someone in any other country that has internet access, right, and a phone. And they can, the communication might be known. Like a government could potentially see, if you're not being super careful, that this account sent this account a message at this time of this many bytes, right, or whatever. But they don't have the private key, so they cannot decrypt what's inside, right? And that is something that you can have faith in, is not been hacked. Similarly, you know, in the realm of finance and money, which has been completely overlooked in the human rights field, there are all these organizations in these different countries which require money to run. I mean, if you are a protester, you have to raise money to be able to coordinate with your colleagues and buy gas masks and water and sustain protest movements. So we've seen this in Hong Kong, in Belarus, and Nigeria over the last year, right? And what the government does is it freezes their bank accounts so that they can't, if they raise money, they can't spend it. So that's why we've been tracking and researching and participating in the Bitcoin revolution, because this allows anyone to send money, again, similar to an app like Signal, send a message privately. This way we can send money in a way that's unstoppable and the government can't censor. And then, you sitting in Scandinavia or wherever you are, me in California, I can send any amount of money within minutes to someone in Belarus. And then all of a sudden it's on their phone and they can use a peer-to-peer marketplace to exchange that for rubles. And then they can go pay for their protest. So we've seen this happen in Nigeria, Hong Kong, Belarus. So we're about to enter a new age where it's actually a lot harder for governments to stop these movements, because we can start actually exchanging not just private messages, but also value with each other. And that's something that people have sort of yet to grasp, I think, in the mainstream media.
That is really cool, because I've been struggling to see the use of Bitcoin, but in this case, it seems real relevant and real powerful. Could you help me understand as well, how will an app like Signal help activists change, big governments like maybe the China one or the Russian one?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is no one could predict when these regimes fall. No empire lasts forever. We know that, right? Historically. And even it seems like the American dominance of the world is starting to crumble if you look at some of the financial tea leaves, and that other regimes are becoming more powerful, and there might be this multipolar world, right, that we're entering into. But I'll give you an example. I mean, my organization, HRF, organized an event about a year and a half ago where we brought together all the top activists from a particular region in the world, in the Middle East, to a place that was secret. And we did all the coordination by Signal. And this way, the activists could have faith that they could communicate with us, gather in secret, not worry about being, abducted. And everything was done over Signal, like booking the plane tickets, all that stuff. And that gave us just this ability to do something that otherwise wouldn't really be practical or safe or feasible. And again, Signal is just one implementation. There are many different open source communication apps that you can go out and look at and use. It just happens to be the one that's probably the most widely used. So it's like most user friendly, I suppose. But there's many, and they're not profit model. I mean, they don't quote unquote make money in the same way as a company like Facebook or Twitter. But they're very influential. I mean, after the Snowden revelations in the United States, we saw users demand encryption after they saw how much the government was spying on us, right? So that's when you saw WhatsApp, and then later Facebook and Twitter, all start to look at encrypted messaging. So that was like a huge win. So now most messaging platforms use some sort of encryption, right? Which is way better than none. And in many cases, they claim to use end-to-end encryption like Telegram does. I mean, we don't know for sure because these aren't open source code bases, but it's certainly heading in the right direction. And just to give you a clear idea, I mean, in Belarus right now, not far from Europe, I mean, you're seeing the people rise up against a brutal dictatorship left over from the Soviet times, and they're not giving up, and they're coordinating on Telegram, and they are raising money with Bitcoin, and they are communicating by secret message, and they are using technology to fight back. And it doesn't mean that they're going to win, but it gives them, a little bit more of an advantage against a slow, stupid state. It's a bit of a David and Goliath thing, but it is remarkable to watch. And it, because all people are tenacious and persistent, and they persevere no matter what, against all odds. This is what I've seen through my work at HRF over the last decade plus. No matter how dark it seems, people always find the light somewhere. But they're just protesting every day. And now it's freezing, of course, but they've been doing it since the summer. It's been a women-led movement. It's really cool. Obviously, the elected leader is a woman, and all the protest leaders, pretty much are women, and they have these women-only marches, and it's groundbreaking in many ways. So I'd certainly encourage your listeners to look more into the Belarus movement there, because it's quite inspiring, and it's largely driven in many ways by technology and by tactics learned from other protests in different parts of the world.
I'm really excited to read up more on that after this interview. So do you think we're going to a worldwide democracy?
I think that long term, as we get more prosperous as a species and we do more trade and we become more advanced, and this technology that empowers the individual becomes stronger, dictatorships become harder to operate, is my thesis, basically. So, for example, we have relics of the past still on Earth today, like North Korea, and there are many other dictatorships like North Korea that are, keep their people walled off from the outside world and brainwashed, and that used to be very possible, and it's just not as possible anymore. Even in North Korea, information seeps in and people are learning about the outside world. So, I mean, information is power, and I just think that over time, there's this like progressive arc to history that's inevitable, but it's uneven, it's very slow. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears are put into it. But I would be long-term optimistic for sure. Yeah, I mean, just look at like the progress of humanity over the last 1,000 years. I mean, people used to have a very high percentage of dying a violent death. People used to only live to 30 or 40 years old. All power was concentrated in the hands of a few. Today, it's not perfect, certainly, but it's so much better than that on almost every level. And I would argue because of like technological advancement and political advancement. So I think there's lots to be hopeful for the long term.
Beautiful. Alex, we're coming towards the end of this podcast now. And you mentioned briefly that if an individual wants to help, they can spread information. What more can they do to help your cause and also to stay up to date with the HRF?
Yeah, well, you can follow our work on Twitter at HRF or me at Gladstein. But I think that one thing that is very specific and very action-oriented is one of our programs called Flash Drives for Freedom. And you can learn more at flashdrivesforfreedom.org. And it's our initiative to take donations of equipment, flash drives, USB keys that you might not use anymore, that might be lying around your house, SD cards. And we give them to South Korean organizations that then load them up with Korean content, dramas, movies, newspaper articles. And then they send them into North Korea, where these things act as windows to the outside world, to people who are stuck, and they can create revolutions in the mind. And it's a very powerful program. So if you want to actually take action, you can go and do that today, and you can send a flash drive and we'll make sure it gets to where it needs to go.
Wow, that's super cool. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. I very much appreciate it.
A lot of fun. Take care.
You too. And for you listening, if you found this conversation as interesting, as important as I did, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because if you do, you're showing the algorithms that this conversation is important, so more people out there can get to know about beautiful inventions like Signal and the importance of Bitcoin. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.